Hello, I'm Angelia Buckingham, a graduate student at Michigan State University. Welcome to my three-part presentation for ED 800 Concepts of Educational Inquiry with Dr. Kristy Cooper Stein. The first part of this presentation will be a summary of my learning related to educational research. The second part of this presentation will focus on summarizing my learning related to the topics addressed during the course with attention given to each book we studied for each of the 5 units. The third part and final part of this presentation will identify the connections that I made across the units of this course. Part 1, summarizing my learning. Social reproduction with ethnography, schools of socializing institutions with portraiture, educational activism with historical analysis, culturally sustaining pedagogy with indigenous research methodologies, and critical pedagogy with philosophy. During the Concepts of Educational Inquiry course with Dr. Kristy Cooper Stein, I looked into 5 different areas of study and methodological approaches to asking questions in the field of education. I learned that there are so many topics in education, such as how teachers learn, how administrators learn, as well as how children learn. This course helped me understand some of the broad fields of educational inquiry. Methodological approaches. I learned details related to ethnography. This is when a researcher goes and spends time with the people that he's going to study. I learned that portraiture is an approach that examines the positive experiences and complexities involved when people engage with one another in certain areas of their life. I found out that historical analysis involves research using historical documents and conduct interviews to identify what happened during a period of time. Also, indigenous research methodologies, which involves participants in a more genuine way, in which writing up the research happens with the research subjects. Philosophy is a field in which theoretical questions are posed for discussion. Areas of study. There were focal topics that went along with the different methodological approaches. The first was social reproduction. This is the idea that society reproduces itself generation after generation, and education is a significant factor. Then there's schools as socializing institutions and how they shape individuals' ideas and how they look at society. Next, there's educational activism, which is how people create change in education and how they fight for access to education. Culturally sustaining pedagogy is where the maintenance of the home culture is central to learning. Lastly, there's critical pedagogy, which instigates action against systems that suppress or misrepresent the acquisition of knowledge. Ain't No Making It, written by J. McLeod. The topic of social reproduction is examined through J. McLeod's ethnographic study in this first book. He conducts a study of young men growing up in a low-income housing project. He follows their progression into adulthood, The impact of social class is explored as it applies to academic aspirations and later to finding employment as an adult. There's an interaction between the inequalities faced by the young men and their individual ability to make decisions that influence their own levels of success. I learned that the social class of the two groups, hallway hangers and brothers, played a significant role in how the young men approached life and growing into adulthood. It was not always the case that those who were white would somehow enjoy the benefits of stable jobs, good family, and productive futures. In some cases, their habitus worked against them. That is to say, if they grew up in a low-income family who placed little or no value on education, then there was a strong possibility that they would do the same based on the familiarity of the process. For example, Jinx is a member of the hallway hangers, and he has potential but refuses to utilize it in exchange for continuing with the familiar behavior of hanging out with his boys. The next book is Troublemakers. In this book, the topic of schools as socializing institutions is examined through Carla Shalaby's portraiture. Disruptive behavior in the classroom is explored in this study of schools as socializing institutions. This unit studied educational justice and explored the pushback that some families and communities against conventional perspectives on young learners who are typically perceived or labeled as troublemakers. The research aligns with and advocates for compassionate and transformative approaches to the demographic of the classroom. I learned that classroom culture can clash with family culture. This causes a barrier for young learners as they try to navigate the contrasting notion of what is expected of them at home and what is expected of them in school. I was not surprised to learn that there are systemic factors that contribute to disruptive behavior in some young learners. For example, students who face discriminatory practices may act out as a response. This was shown in the portraiture of Zora. She's a young learner who comes from a culturally mixed family. The belief systems that were taught to her from her family did not coincide with those systems that the majority or the white children in the classroom were brought up on. As a result, she was discriminated against based on her family's differences. This created a view that she was somehow a troublemaker and nonconformer. Next, there is In Pursuit of Knowledge. In this book, the topic of educational activism is examined through Cabria Baumgartner's historical analysis. Throughout the book, the idea of purposeful womanhood reoccurred as a call to action for those who opposed racism and unfair practices, such as when the women of color attempted to get an education. In addition to fighting for the right to be educated, many of the women of color also had to prove that they had some sort of measurable worth. They worked hard to overcome the stereotypes about women, such as uneducated, without skills, without ambition, etc. The book took a look at the Canterbury Female Seminary in the first part and the Young Ladies Domestic Seminary. These private female seminaries were known for producing educated women of color. They encountered violence and ridicule as a result of wanting to establish a purpose in life. Protecting the Promise. In this book, The topic of culturally sustaining pedagogy is examined through Timothy San Pedro's indigenous research methodologies. Blending ethnographic research and personal narrative helps the authors illustrate the intricacies of indigenous education. The relationship between a mother and her children is vital for the transmission of knowledge from generation to generation. In this book, I learned that keeping cultural traditions strong in the community was a significant responsibility of the mother, and this would sometimes necessitate being aggressive against the local governments and those in power over the indigenous communities. For example, Demetrius mentioned that school was uninteresting because he did not see a representation of himself in the things that were being taught. Pushing back against the Western curricula is one way that the leaders in the community exerted their collective powers over local government and lawmakers. I also learned about the 4 R's: responsibility, respect, reciprocity, and relationality. I felt that the book was insightful in shedding light on the challenges and triumphs that come along with preserving the promise of indigenous education. Pedagogy of resistance. In this book, the topic of critical pedagogy is examined through Henry A. Giroux' philosophy of education. He explains that the achievement of critical pedagogy depends on critical consciousness, being aware of the negative forces in the world and work to eradicate them. The forces of Trumpism and white supremacy calls for the explicit need for critical pedagogy. He also illustrates how pedagogy of resistance can be a tool for fighting back against those negative forces. I learned that there are many philosophers who actively think, talk, and write about topics in pedagogy. Giroux' argument seems to center on education being significant in the fight against ignorance. At first glance, I felt that was a given. As I read and analyzed more of his writing, I thought more deeply about his argument. He also posits that education is taking away individual freedom. I'm not sure if I agree with this 100% because for some groups, not having the education will lessen their freedoms. Okay, I have reached part 3 of my presentation. This is where I make my connections. Okay, so initially I thought of troublemakers having a connection to Ain't No Making It and pedagogy of resistance. I feel that the story of the young man illustrates that the educational system removed the freedoms of the two groups. One group, the hallway hangers, pushed back against it at the cost of leading a less than productive life. There were many instances where the boys mentioned that there was no point in completing school because they would only be putting all that effort into the educational system for no reason. They didn't see how they would be able to get decent jobs, and the educational system only sought to place them in programs that did little or nothing to provide them with what they felt they needed. In Pedagogy of Resistance, one of the things Giroux says is that education takes away individual freedoms. I feel that the hallway hangers represent what is meant by that statement. Okay, the next one is protecting the promise. Protecting the promise connects to In Pursuit of Knowledge in that both groups face situations that are trying to establish barriers to prevent them from getting the education they want on their terms. With Protecting the Promise, mothers are pushing back against Western curricula because it doesn't reflect their culture. In Pursuit of Knowledge, A group has to struggle against an establishment that wants to hinder their education. Both groups in both books are facing difficult situations, and the situations are enforced by those who have power over them. Okay, and the last connection I want to discuss is pedagogy of resistance, connecting with troublemakers. Because of the concept of democracy that Jarrell brings up, it occurred to me that troublemakers may connect with this because in a democracy, the power belongs to the people. In troublemakers, this seems to be the issue. The majority decides on the rules and how the school culture should be organized. The students in troublemakers are all outliers to that democracy. They are not part of the majority and therefore have no substantial voice.